Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The year was 1895, and deep within the rolling hills of the Ozark Mountains, where ancient limestone bluffs pierced through dense canopies of oak and hickory, a silence had begun to settle over a small log cabin that would soon become legendary for all the wrong reasons. The morning mist clung to the valleys like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in that labyrinth of wilderness, the Carter family was about to become part of a mystery that would haunt these mountains for generations to come. Picture, if you will, the Arkansas wilderness of the late 19th century. This was a land where civilization's reach grew thin, where the nearest neighbor might be miles away through treacherous terrain, and where the line between the natural and supernatural seemed to blur with each passing shadow. The Ozark Mountains had always been a place of whispered legends, Cherokee spirits, lost settlers, and things that moved through the forest when decent folk were safely asleep behind locked doors. It was into this world that the Carter family had ventured, seeking something that many pioneers of their era desperately craved: a fresh start, independence, and land they could call their own. But the mountains, ancient and indifferent to human ambition, had their own plans for the Carter cabin. What began as a dream of frontier prosperity would transform into something far more sinister, a tomb that would challenge everything the local community thought they knew about death, isolation, and the dark secrets that the wilderness could keep. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just another tale of frontier hardship. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly hope can turn to horror, how isolation can become a prison, and how sometimes the very place we choose as our sanctuary becomes our final resting place. The Carter family cabin still stands today, weathered and abandoned, but those who know its history approach it with a mixture of fascination and dread. Local residents speak of it in hushed tones, and even the bravest among them admit to feeling an unexplainable chill when they pass by the old homestead. What happened to the Carter family during that fateful winter of 1895 remains one of the most perplexing and disturbing mysteries in Ozark folklore. The official records are sparse, witnesses were few, and the physical evidence raised more questions than it answered. But the story persists, passed down through generations of mountain folk who understand that some truths are too strange for official documentation, yet too persistent to dismiss as mere superstition. As we delve deeper into this mystery, we'll explore not just what happened to the Carter family, but why their story continues to resonate more than a century later. We'll examine the harsh realities of frontier life, the psychological toll of extreme isolation, and the various theories that have emerged to explain how a family's dream home became their eternal prison. Most importantly, we'll confront the unsettling possibility that some questions about human fate and the nature of evil may never have satisfactory answers. The Ozark Mountains keep their secrets well, but tonight, we're going to attempt to uncover the truth behind one of their most chilling mysteries. So settle in and prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of darkness that lies hidden in America's frontier past. A journey to the Carter family cabin where dreams died and nightmares were born. In the spring of 1894, Samuel Carter stood on the front porch of his modest home in Little Rock, Arkansas, gazing toward the distant mountains that promised both opportunity and uncertainty. At 34 years old, Samuel was a man shaped by the economic uncertainties of the post-Civil War era, watching as the nation struggled to rebuild itself, while men like him searched for their place in a rapidly changing world. The financial panic of 1893 had devastated many families across the South, and the Carters were no exception. Samuel's work as a blacksmith had dwindled as newer technologies and economic hardships reduced demand for his traditional skills. Beside him stood his wife, Margaret, 28 years old and possessed of the quiet strength that frontier women cultivated out of necessity rather than choice. She held their youngest child, 3-year-old Emma, while their other children, 10-year-old Thomas and 7-year-old Sarah, played in the yard with the carefree abandon of youth who couldn't yet comprehend the weight of their family's circumstances. Margaret had grown up hearing stories of the western frontier from her father, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, and while she understood the risks of frontier life, she also recognized that staying in Little Rock might mean watching their family sink deeper into poverty. The decision to relocate to the Ozark Mountains wasn't made lightly. Samuel had heard reports of fertile valleys hidden among the hills, places where a man could claim land, build a homestead, and create a life independent of the economic uncertainties that plagued the cities. The Homestead Act still offered opportunities for families willing to brave the wilderness, and the isolation that might deter others actually appealed to Samuel. He had grown weary of the crowded conditions in Little Rock, the constant struggle to find work, and a feeling that he was failing to provide adequately for his family. Margaret's brother, James, had ventured into the Ozarks 2 years earlier and sent back letters describing a landscape of incredible beauty and potential. He wrote of crystal-clear streams teeming with fish, forests abundant with game, and soil that, while rocky, could support crops and livestock with proper care. More importantly, he described a sense of freedom that city life couldn't provide. The freedom to succeed or fail based on one's own efforts rather than the whims of distant economic forces. The family spent months preparing for their departure. Samuel sold his blacksmith tools and equipment, keeping only the most essential items for frontier life. Margaret carefully packed their belongings, prioritizing practical items while reluctantly leaving behind family heirlooms and sentimental possessions that simply couldn't make the journey. The children, particularly Thomas, seemed excited by the prospect of adventure, though Sarah showed signs of anxiety about leaving the only home she had ever known. In late summer of 1894, the Carter family loaded their possessions onto a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 oxen and began their journey into the Ozark wilderness. The first part of their trip followed established roads and trails, passing through small towns where they could rest, resupply, and gather information about the territory ahead. But as they penetrated deeper into the mountains, civilization's comforts became increasingly scarce, and the family found themselves dependent entirely on their own resources and the occasional kindness of fellow travelers. The landscape that surrounded them was both breathtaking and intimidating. Ancient limestone bluffs rose like fortress walls from the valley floors, their faces carved by millennia of wind and water into fantastic shapes that seemed to watch the Pool. Avlers with stony indifference, dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine covered the hillsides, their canopies so thick that even midday sunlight filtered through in dappled patterns that created an ever-changing mosaic of light and shadow. Crystal-clear streams wound through the valleys, their waters so pure that they seemed almost supernatural, reflecting the sky with mirror-like clarity. But for all its beauty, the wilderness also presented constant challenges. The trails were often little more than game paths, forcing the family to navigate carefully to avoid losing their way in the maze of ridges and valleys. Weather could change rapidly in the mountains, with sudden thunderstorms turning peaceful streams into raging torrents and fog descending so thick that visibility dropped to mere yards. The nights brought sounds that city-dwelling ears weren't accustomed to. The howl of wolves, the scream of panthers, and mysterious rustlings in the underbrush that could indicate anything from foraging raccoons to more dangerous predators. After 3 weeks of travel, following directions provided by Margaret's brother and local guides, they encountered along the way, the Carter family finally reached their destination. A remote valley tucked between two substantial ridges, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound down from the higher elevations. The valley was approximately 2 miles long and half a mile wide, with a clear stream running along its western edge and fertile bottomland that showed promise for farming. More importantly for their immediate needs, the valley contained several natural clearings that would reduce the backbreaking work of clearing forest for building sites and cropland. Samuel chose a building site on a slight rise about a quarter-mile from the stream, positioned to take advantage of morning sunlight while providing protection from the harsh western winds that could sweep down from the ridges during winter storms. The location offered a commanding view of the valley's length, while remaining sheltered enough to feel secure from both weather and any potential threats that might emerge from the surrounding wilderness. Construction of the cabin began immediately, as Samuel knew that winter would arrive early in the mountains, and his family needed substantial shelter to survive their first year in the wilderness. Using hand tools and techniques passed down through generations of frontier builders, Samuel began the laborious process of selecting, cutting, and preparing the logs that would form their new home. The cabin would be modest by any standard, a single room measuring roughly 16 by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace on one end and a small loft area where the children could sleep. Margaret proved invaluable during the construction process, not only caring for the children and managing their daily needs, but also assisting with the building work itself. She helped position logs, applied chinking between the timbers, and worked alongside Samuel to create a home that would protect their family through the harsh mountain winters that lay ahead. The children, too, contributed according to their abilities, with Thomas proving particularly helpful in gathering stones for the fireplace, and Sarah assisting her mother with domestic tasks. As autumn painted the surrounding hillsides in brilliant shades of red, gold, and orange, the Carter family cabin began to take shape. The structure was solid and well-built, constructed with the kind of attention to detail that came from understanding that their lives would literally depend on the quality of their work. Samuel chinked the walls with a mixture of mud, moss, and small stones, creating barriers against both cold and moisture. The roof, covered with hand-split oak shakes, was designed to shed rain and snow while providing adequate insulation for the living space below. By the first week of November, the cabin was complete enough for the family to move inside. Margaret had fashioned simple furniture from split logs and boards, creating beds, a dining table, and storage containers that would serve their basic needs. Samuel constructed a sturdy door from oak planks and fitted it with a heavy wooden bar that could be dropped into place for security. Small windows on the east and south walls provided light during the day, while remaining small enough to conserve heat during the cold months ahead. As they settled into their new home, the Carter family felt a sense of accomplishment and cautious optimism. They had successfully transported their family and possessions into the wilderness, constructed a shelter capable of protecting them through winter, and established themselves in a location that offered both security and potential for future prosperity. Samuel had already identified areas suitable for crops and pasture, while Margaret had begun preserving foods and preparing for the self-sufficient lifestyle that mountain living demanded. The cabin itself seemed to radiate warmth and security as winter approached. Smoke from the stone fireplace rose straight and clean into the crisp mountain air, and the golden glow of candlelight in the windows created a welcoming beacon in the vast wilderness that surrounded them. From the outside, the Carter homestead looked like a testament to human determination and the pioneer spirit that was taming the American frontier one family at a time. But the mountains had been watching, and the mountains had their own plans for the Carter family cabin. Winter in the Ozark Mountains descended like a living thing, wrapping the Carter family's valley in a blanket of silence that seemed to muffle not just sound, but hope itself. By December of 1894, the cheerful autumn colors had long since faded, leaving Bay in a landscape of stark beauty and unforgiving harshness. Snow lay deep in the hollows and clung to the north-facing slopes, while ice formed thick sheets over the streams and ponds. The cabin that had seemed so welcoming during construction now stood as the family's only barrier against a wilderness that had grown suddenly hostile and alien. Inside the log walls, the Carter family adapted to a routine dictated by the rhythms of winter survival. Samuel would rise before dawn to tend the fire, adding logs to coals that were never allowed to die completely, for rekindling a fire in sub-zero temperatures could mean the difference between life and death. The single room that served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom for the adults grew thick with the smoke of cooking fires and the breath of 5 human beings living in close quarters. Margaret had hung heavy blankets across the interior to create some privacy and help contain heat, but the family lived in constant awareness of each other's presence. The children, Thomas and Sarah, had initially found the winter routine exciting, a grand adventure that made them feel like the frontier heroes in the stories their father sometimes told. But as the weeks stretched on and the cold grew more bitter, even their resilient spirits began to show signs of strain. 3-year-old Emma, too young to understand their circumstances, became increasingly fretful and prone to crying fits that echoed through the small space like accusations against the decision that had brought them to this isolated place. Samuel spent his days maintaining their shelter, checking and rechecking the chinking between logs for gaps that might let in deadly cold, and venturing out into the snow to hunt for game or gather firewood. The forest that had seemed so abundant during the autumn now revealed itself as a place of scarcity and danger. Game was scarce, driven to shelter by the same bitter cold that threatened the Carter family. The rabbits and squirrels that had been plentiful during warmer months now remained hidden in burrows and hollow trees, while larger game had migrated to lower elevations or deeper into the wilderness, where Samuel dared not venture alone. Margaret managed the domestic challenges of keeping her family fed, clothed, and healthy through the long winter months. She rationed their stored provisions with mathematical precision, calculating how much flour, salt pork, and preserved vegetables they could consume each day while still maintaining enough reserves to last until spring. She mended clothes by candlelight, patched boots with leather scraps, and struggled to keep their garments dry in the humid confines of the cabin where wet clothes took days to properly dry. But it was the isolation that proved most difficult to bear. During their first month in the valley, the Carter family had occasionally encountered other settlers passing through the area, hunters, trappers, and fellow homesteaders who provided welcome company and news from the outside world. Winter had ended all such contact. The trail leading out of their valley became impassable except for someone traveling on foot with snowshoes, and even then, such a journey would be extremely dangerous for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. The silence of their isolation was profound and unsettling. In Little Rock, the Carter family had lived surrounded by the constant sounds of civilization. Conversations from neighboring houses, the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestone streets, the familiar rhythm of human activity that continued throughout the day and night. In the mountain cabin, the only sounds were those they made themselves, and the occasional crack of settling timber or the whistle of wind through the forest. On the stillest nights, the silence was so complete that it seemed to press against their eardrums, like a physical presence. It was during these quiet hours that the family first began to notice sounds that didn't quite fit the natural patterns they had grown accustomed to. Samuel, whose blacksmith work had given him acute hearing and an ability to identify the source and meaning of various sounds, began to detect subtle disturbances in the nighttime quiet. Sometimes it was a rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the direction of the forest. Not the random drumming of a woodpecker, but a deliberate pattern that would continue for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Other times, he heard what sounded like footsteps circling the cabin, though investigation the following morning never revealed tracks in the snow. Margaret, whose maternal instincts had been sharpened by years of protecting her children, also began to sense that something was amiss. She noticed that their dog, Rex, a mixed-breed animal that Samuel had acquired just before their departure from Little Rock, had begun displaying unusual behavior. The dog, which had previously slept peacefully near the fireplace, now spent much of the night alert and restless, occasionally raising his head to stare at the door or windows with an intensity that made Margaret deeply uncomfortable. The children, with the heightened sensitivity that young people often possess, also began to report strange experiences. Thomas claimed that he sometimes heard voices calling his name from outside the cabin, though when he alerted his parents, they heard nothing unusual. Sarah developed a fear of the loft area where she and Thomas slept, insisting that she could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. Even little Emma seemed affected, often waking in the middle of the night crying and pointing toward the corners of the cabin where shadows gathered most thickly. Samuel initially dismissed these reports as products of imagination, heightened by isolation and stress. He had read accounts of other frontier families experiencing similar phenomena, what some called cabin fever, and attributed his family's experiences to the psychological strain of being confined in a small space throughout the long winter months. But as the weeks passed, and the strange occurrences became more frequent and more difficult to explain away, he began to wonder if there might be some external cause for their growing unease. The first tangible evidence that something unusual was occurring came in late January, when Samuel discovered that tools he had left outside the cabin were being moved during the night. His axe, which he always placed against the woodpile in exactly the same position, would be found yards away, sometimes buried blade deep in tree trunks as if thrown with tremendous force. Iron traps he had set for small game would be sprung and scattered, though there was no sign that any animal had been caught or even approached the devices. Most disturbing were the marks that began appearing in the snow around the cabin. Samuel was an experienced woodsman who could identify the tracks of virtually every animal native to the Ozark Mountains, but the impressions he found defied easy classification. Some appeared almost human, but were far too large and showed signs of claws rather than toes. Others seemed to indicate a creature that walked sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4, leaving a trail that meandered around the cabin in patterns that suggested deliberate surveillance rather than casual animal movement. Margaret began to keep a written record of the unusual events, partly to help her family make sense of what they were experiencing, and partly because she suspected that if something serious happened to them, a written account might help others understand their fate. Her journal entries from this period reveal a woman struggling to maintain rational explanations for increasingly irrational circumstances while simultaneously preparing her family for possibilities she didn't want to contemplate. February 3rd, she wrote. Rex refused to go outside today, even for necessary business. When Samuel tried to force him out, the dog became nearly hysterical, clawing at the door to get back inside. Thomas says he heard scratching on the roof last night, like something large was walking around up there. Samuel found no tracks this morning, but the snow on the roof had been disturbed in patterns that don't match any wind damage we've seen. February 7th, another entry recorded. Sarah woke screaming that something was looking at her through the window. When we investigated, we found handprints pressed against the glass from the outside, but they were too high up for any person to have made them without a ladder, and there were no ladder marks or footprints in the snow below the window. The family's food supplies, carefully rationed to last through winter, began disappearing at an alarming rate. Samuel constructed increasingly elaborate storage systems, but containers that had been securely sealed would be found empty, their contents vanished without any sign of how they had been accessed. The family began eating less, stretching their remaining provisions, while Samuel ventured farther and farther from the cabin in desperate searches for game to supplement their dwindling stores. It was during one of these hunting expeditions in mid-February that Samuel encountered something that shattered his remaining skepticism about the supernatural nature of their situation. Following what appeared to be deer tracks through fresh snow, he had penetrated about 2 miles from the cabin when he came upon a clearing he had never seen before, despite his thorough exploration of the valley during the previous autumn. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of standing stones, not the natural limestone formations common to the area, but deliberately placed markers that showed signs of human construction. The stones were covered with symbols that Samuel didn't recognize, carved deep into the rock surface with tools that had left marks unlike anything made by conventional frontier implements. More disturbing still, the area around the stone circle was bare of snow, despite the fact that heavy snowfall had occurred just 2 days earlier. The ground within the circle was dark and soft, as if warmed by some underground source, and Samuel noticed a smell in the air, sweet and corrupt, like flowers left too long in a closed room. As Samuel stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to understand what he was seeing, he became aware that he was being watched. The sensation was so strong and immediate that he spun around, rifle at the ready, but saw nothing unusual in the forest behind him. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger by the moment, until Samuel felt as if invisible eyes were examining him from multiple directions simultaneously. The forest, which had been filled with the normal sounds of winter wildlife, fell completely silent. Samuel retreated from the clearing as quickly as dignity and caution would allow, but he carried the memory of what he had seen back to the cabin, like a poison that would slowly spread through his family's remaining hope. That night, he told Margaret about the stone circle, but swore her to secrecy, fearing that knowledge of such a place would only increase the children's anxiety. Margaret, however, understood immediately that their situation had moved beyond the realm of natural explanation and into territory that their Christian faith and frontier pragmatism had never prepared them to navigate. The final weeks of February brought increasingly frequent and disturbing incidents. Tools and household items disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations. Food spoiled overnight despite the cold temperatures that should have preserved it. The cabin itself began to show signs of deterioration that couldn't be explained by normal wear and weather. Boards warping, chinking falling out, and joints separating, as if the very structure was being systematically weakened by forces the family couldn't see or understand. But it was the nights that truly tested the Carter family's endurance. The sounds that had initially been subtle and intermittent grew louder and more persistent. The rhythmic tapping became a constant drumming that seemed to emanate from beneath the cabin's floorboards. Voices could be heard calling from the forest, sometimes mimicking the voices of family members, other times speaking in languages that sounded ancient and hostile. The dog, Rex, eventually refused to sleep inside the cabin at all, preferring to shiver in the woodshed rather than remain in the house with the family. Samuel began sleeping with his rifle across his chest and a loaded pistol within easy reach, though he had no idea what kind of threat he might need to defend against. Margaret kept the children close to her at all times, creating a nest of blankets near the fireplace where the family huddled together through the long, terrifying nights. The cabin that had once represented their dreams of independence and prosperity had become a prison where they waited for dawn, and prayed that whatever stalked them in the darkness would eventually lose interest and move on to other prey. But the mountains had made their choice, and the Carter family cabin was about to fulfill a destiny that had been decided long before Samuel Carter ever dreamed of leaving Little Rock. The thing that watched them from the forest was patient, methodical, and utterly indifferent to their human hopes and fears. It had been waiting in the valley for generations, and it would wait for generations more if necessary. March was coming, and with it, the final act of a tragedy that had been unfolding since the moment the Carter family first set foot in their chosen valley. As March arrived in the Ozark Mountains, bringing with it the first tentative signs of spring's return, the Carter family found themselves trapped in a nightmare that seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing day. The warming temperatures that should have brought relief and hope instead seemed to awaken something in the forest around their cabin, something that had been dormant during the deepest winter months, but now stirred with an energy that felt both ancient and malevolent. Samuel noticed the change first. He had developed the heightened awareness that comes from living under constant threat, and his senses detected subtle alterations in the very atmosphere of their valley. The morning mist that rose from the warming streams carried scents that seemed wrong, not the clean, earthy smell of spring thaw, but something organic and corrupt, like meat left too long in a warm place. The birds that should have been returning from their winter refuges remained absent, leaving the forest eerily quiet, except for sounds that Samuel's woodsman's experience couldn't identify or explain. Margaret's journal entries from early March reveal a woman struggling to maintain her sanity while protecting her children from forces she couldn't understand. March 5th, she wrote in handwriting that had become increasingly erratic. The tapping from beneath the floor has become constant. Samuel tore up several floorboards yesterday to investigate, but found nothing except dirt that was warm to the touch and smelled of sulfur. Emma has stopped speaking entirely and will only communicate by pointing. Thomas claims he saw someone standing at the edge of the forest yesterday, someone tall and thin, who watched the cabin for hours without moving. The family's food situation had become desperate. Despite Samuel's best efforts at hunting and Margaret's careful rationing, their supplies were nearly exhausted. The game that should have been emerging from winter dormancy remained mysteriously absent from their valley, as if every living creature except the Carter family had fled from some approaching danger. Samuel had been forced to venture farther and farther from the cabin in his search for sustenance, sometimes staying away for entire days, while Margaret and the children huddled together, listening to the sounds that seemed to grow bolder in his absence. It was during one of these extended hunting trips that Samuel made a discovery that filled him with a dread so profound it seemed to stop his heart. Following a creek bed that wound through a narrow canyon about 5 miles from the cabin, he came upon the remains of what had once been another homestead, but this wasn't marked on any of the maps or mentioned in any of the information he had gathered before selecting their valley. The cabin had been substantial, larger than his own family's dwelling, and constructed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested builders who had intended to stay for many years. But the structure was now a ruin, and not from the normal decay that time and weather would bring to an abandoned building. The logs had been pulled apart systematically, arranged in patterns around the clearing that reminded Samuel uncomfortably of the stone circle he had discovered months earlier. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the area: clothing, tools, furniture, and household items that had been arranged in configurations that suggested some kind of ritual purpose rather than the random distribution that scavengers or weather would create. Most disturbing were the bones. Samuel found human remains scattered throughout the clearing, but they had been placed with deliberate care rather than left where death had claimed their owners. Skulls had been arranged in a circle around what had once been the cabin's fireplace. Larger bones formed geometric patterns that hurt Samuel's eyes to look at directly. Smaller bones had been used to create symbols carved into the earth itself, symbols that matched those Samuel had seen on the standing stones in the other clearing. The bones showed signs of violence that made Samuel's stomach turn. Deep scratches scored the surfaces, not the marks of scavenging animals, but gouges that suggested something with claws far larger and stronger than any creature Samuel knew to inhabit the Ozark Mountains. Some of the skulls showed holes that were too large and irregularly shaped to have been made by bullets or conventional weapons. The arrangement of the remains suggested that whatever had killed the previous inhabitants had taken considerable time with its work, displaying a methodical cruelty that spoke of intelligence rather than animal instinct. Samuel found remnants of a journal among the scattered belongings, its pages water-damaged and partially illegible. But what he could read filled him with horror that reached to his very soul. The entries described experiences almost identical to what his own family had been enduring. The strange sounds, the missing items, the sense of being watched by something that remained just beyond the edge of perception. But these accounts went further, describing encounters with something the writer called the Watcher, a creature that seemed to feed on fear and isolation, growing stronger as its victims grew weaker. The final entries in the damaged journal were written in handwriting that deteriorated from careful script to frantic scrawling, describing nights when the thing that stalked them had begun to take physical form. "It stands at the tree line every night now," one entry read. "Taller than any man, with arms that hang nearly to the ground. Its face, God forgive me, I cannot describe its face. The children scream when they see it, but it never comes closer. It's waiting, always waiting." The last legible entry was dated just 2 days before the final one, and it consisted of only a few words scrawled in what appeared to be blood. "It's in the cabin. God help us all." Samuel spent hours searching the ruined homestead for any clue about the identity of the previous inhabitants or the timeline of their destruction. He found fragments of letters and documents that suggested the family had been named Morrison and had settled in the area sometime in the 1870s. Like the Carters, they had been seeking a fresh start in the wilderness, drawn by the same promises of independence and prosperity that had motivated Samuel to bring his own family to this cursed valley. The parallels between the Morrison family's experience and his own were too numerous and specific to dismiss as coincidence. Samuel realized with growing horror that his family was not the first to be drawn to this particular valley, and they would likely not be the last unless something fundamental changed. The thing that had destroyed the Morrison family was still present, still waiting, still patient in its hunger for human suffering and death. When Samuel returned to his own cabin after 3 days of investigating the Morrison homestead, he found his family in a state of near collapse. Margaret met him at the door with eyes that held the wild look of someone pushed to the very edge of sanity. "It came closer," she whispered, clutching his arm with fingers that left bruises. "While you were gone, it came right up to the windows. The children saw it clearly this time. Thomas tried to describe it to me, but he couldn't find words. He just kept saying it was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. 7-year-old Sarah had developed a fever that didn't respond to any of Margaret's home remedies, and she spent most of her time in a delirium that filled the cabin with her frightened rambling. "The tall man wants to come inside," she would whisper over and over again. "The tall man is hungry. The tall man has been waiting so long." Little Emma had stopped eating entirely and would only drink water, staring at the cabin's corners with eyes that seemed to see things her parents couldn't perceive. Even Rex, the family dog, who had been their early warning system for supernatural disturbances, had undergone a disturbing transformation. The animal no longer showed fear when the strange phenomena occurred. Instead, he would sit perfectly still and stare at empty spaces with an intensity that suggested he was watching something move through the cabin. Sometimes he would follow these invisible presences with his eyes, his head turning slowly to track movement that the human members of the family couldn't detect. Samuel made the decision that he should have made months earlier, but by then it may have been too late. He began preparations to abandon the cabin and attempt to reach civilization, even though such a journey in early March would be extremely dangerous for his weakened and terrified family. He constructed a crude sled from materials salvaged from the cabin's interior, loaded it with their most essential possessions, and prepared to attempt a journey that might kill them through exposure and exhaustion, but offered their only hope of escape from whatever had claimed their valley as its hunting ground. But the thing that watched them from the forest had no intention of allowing its prey to escape. On the night before their planned departure, the Carter family experienced an escalation of supernatural activity that transformed their cabin from a shelter into a trap from which there would be no escape. It began with sounds that seemed to come from inside the cabin's walls, scratching, gnawing, and a liquid dripping noise that suggested something was moving through spaces that shouldn't have existed. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted despite the roaring fire Samuel had built, and their breath became visible in clouds of vapor that took strange shapes before dissipating. The very air seemed to thicken, making breathing difficult and movement sluggish, as if the atmosphere itself had become hostile to human life. Margaret gathered the children around the fireplace, while Samuel positioned himself near the door with his rifle. Though both parents understood that conventional weapons would likely prove useless against whatever was tormenting them. The sounds grew louder and more distinct, resolving into what could only be described as voices, but voices speaking in harmonies that human throats couldn't produce, using words from languages that predated human civilization. And then, for the first time since their ordeal had begun, the thing that had been stalking them made itself fully visible. It appeared first as a shadow cast by firelight, but a shadow that moved independently of any object that might have created it. The shadow stretched across the cabin's floor, climbed the walls, and spread across the ceiling like a living stain that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Within the darkness of the shadow, shapes began to form, suggestions of limbs and facial features that assembled and dissolved in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. Thomas, the eldest child, pointed toward the cabin's main window and screamed with a terror so pure that it seemed to shatter something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. Standing outside the glass, clearly visible in the firelight, was the creature that had been watching them for months. Samuel's mind, already strained to the breaking point by weeks of supernatural harassment, struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. The thing was roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in every proportion and detail. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with arms that hung to its knees and fingers that ended in claws the length of kitchen knives. Its skin appeared to be the color and texture of old leather, stretched tight over a frame that suggested bones arranged in configurations that defied human anatomy. But it was the creature's face that finally broke Samuel's sanity, a collection of features that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as he watched, sometimes resembling a human visage, sometimes resembling the faces of animals he couldn't identify, and sometimes resembling nothing that should exist in any world where sanity was possible. The creature's eyes were the worst feature of all. They were large and luminous, reflecting the cabin's firelight with an intelligence that was unmistakably ancient and utterly malevolent. When those eyes fixed on Samuel's face, he felt something fundamental inside his mind snap like a thread pulled too tight. The thing was not just looking at him, it was examining him, evaluating him, savoring the fear and despair that radiated from the cabin like heat from a forge. Margaret screamed, and her scream seemed to act as a signal for the final phase of their ordeal to begin. The cabin's windows exploded inward simultaneously, showering the family with glass while allowing the March night air to rush in like a living thing. The creature outside began to change shape, flowing like liquid darkness through the broken window frames, while maintaining just enough solidity to manipulate objects in the physical world. Samuel fired his rifle at the intruding presence, but the bullets passed through it without effect, embedding themselves in the cabin's far wall while the creature continued its methodical entry into their home. Margaret tried to shepherd the children toward the door, but the wooden barrier had somehow become immovable, sealed as securely as if it had been nailed shut from the outside. The last entry in Margaret's journal, found months later by the men who discovered the cabin, consisted of only 3 words written in a handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. It's inside now. What happened during the final hours in the Carter family cabin would remain one of the Ozark Mountains' darkest mysteries, but the evidence left behind would haunt everyone who encountered it for the rest of their lives. The valley had claimed another family, and the thing that had been waiting in the wilderness had fed once again on human terror and despair. The cabin stood silent in the morning light, its broken windows staring like empty eye sockets across the valley where spring was finally beginning to show its first tentative signs. But spring would bring no renewal to the Carter homestead, only discovery and horror and questions that would never be satisfactorily answered. The discovery of what had befallen the Carter family came on a warm morning in late May 1895, when a party of surveyors working for the Missouri Pacific Railroad ventured into the remote valley to assess its potential for a future rail line. The men, led by Chief Surveyor William Hastings, had been mapping the mountainous terrain for several weeks, but nothing in their previous experience had prepared them for what they would find at the Carter homestead. Hastings later wrote in his official report that the first indication something was amiss came from their pack animals. The horses and mules that had been reliable and calm throughout their mountain survey suddenly became agitated as they approached the valley, refusing to proceed down the trail despite the efforts of their handlers. The animals showed signs of extreme distress, rolling eyes, flattened ears, and a skittishness that suggested they detected something their human companions couldn't perceive. The very air seemed different in that valley, Hastings wrote. It was warmer than the surrounding elevations, which should have been pleasant after the cool mountain mornings we had grown accustomed to. But the warmth felt unnatural, like the heat that rises from a fever victim, and it carried scents that made our stomachs turn. Even before we saw the cabin, we knew we were approaching something that would challenge our understanding of the natural world. The cabin itself was visible from a considerable distance, standing alone in the clearing that Samuel Carter had so carefully selected for his family's new home. But even from afar, the surveying party could see that something was fundamentally wrong with the structure. The building appeared to sag in the middle, as if some tremendous weight had been placed on its roof, and the windows gaped like wounds in the log walls. Most disturbing was the complete absence of any sign of life. No smoke from the chimney, no movement of any kind, no response to their shouts of greeting as they approached. As the survey party drew closer to the cabin, details became visible that would be seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. The door stood wide open, hanging from one hinge, as if it had been torn from its frame by tremendous force, applied from the inside. Personal belongings were scattered around the clearing in patterns that suggested they had been thrown from the cabin rather than carried out in any organized evacuation. Clothing, tools, and household items lay strewn across an area covering several hundred square yards, arranged in configurations that reminded the observers uncomfortably of the ritualistic displays they had heard described in stories of savage warfare. But it was the smell that stopped the survey party in their tracks while they were still 50 yards from the cabin's entrance. The odor was unlike anything in their collective experience, sweet and corrupt, like flowers left too long in a closed room, but with undertones of decay that suggested something organic had been rotting in the spring warmth for an extended period. The scent was so overwhelming that several of the men were forced to retreat upwind to prevent themselves from becoming physically ill. Hastings, as the senior member of the party, took upon himself the responsibility of entering the cabin to determine what had happened to its inhabitants. He wrapped a bandana around his face to filter the worst of the stench, and approached the gaping doorway with a mixture of professional duty and human dread. What he found inside the Carter family cabin would be described in his official report as evidence of a tragedy so profound and disturbing that it challenges the very foundations of rational thought. The interior of the cabin was in a state of devastation that couldn't be explained by any natural disaster or conventional human violence. Furniture had been smashed and scattered, but not randomly. The destroyed items had been arranged in patterns around the central room that reminded Hastings of the occult symbols he had seen in books about ancient religions. The floorboards had been torn up in several places, revealing earth underneath that was stained dark with substances Hastings preferred not to identify. But most horrifying were the walls themselves. Every interior surface of the cabin was covered with markings that appeared to have been carved into the wood with tremendous force. Some of the symbols resembled letters from alphabets Hastings didn't recognize, while others seemed to be pictographic representations of scenes too disturbing to contemplate. The marks were deep and appeared fresh, as if they had been created recently, but the tools that would have been required to carve such extensive designs into seasoned hardwood were nowhere to be found. The fireplace, which should have been the cabin's heart and the symbol of domestic comfort, had been transformed into something that made Hastings' blood run cold. The stones had been rearranged in patterns that defied both engineering principles and aesthetic sense, creating a structure that seemed designed for purposes other than providing warmth or cooking facilities. Dark stains covered the altered stonework, and the smell of corruption was strongest near this modified hearth. Of the Carter family themselves, there was no immediate sign. Their personal belongings were present: clothing, shoes, and intimate items that suggested the family had been in residence until very recently. But the people who had worn and used these objects had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Hastings spent nearly an hour searching the cabin and its immediate surroundings, calling out for any survivors who might be hiding in the forest. But his shouts echoed unanswered through the valley. It was only when Hastings began a more systematic search of the property that he made the discovery that would transform the Carter homestead from a mystery into a legend. Following a trail of disturbed earth that led from the cabin toward the tree line, he found what appeared to be a series of shallow graves marked only by stones, arranged in the same mystifying patterns that had been carved into the cabin's walls. The graves, if that's what they were, had been dug in ground that should have been frozen solid until very recently. The earth showed signs of having been excavated and recovered multiple times, creating mounds that were irregular in shape and size. Some appeared large enough to contain human bodies, while others were so small they could only have held fragments or parts of what had once been whole people. Hastings, despite his revulsion and growing fear, understood that his discovery would require official investigation. He marked the location carefully on his survey maps and began the journey back to the nearest town to report what he had found to the proper authorities. But before leaving the valley, he took one final look back at the Carter cabin and noticed something that filled him with a terror so profound he would never speak of it publicly. Standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible among the shadows of the trees, was a figure that watched him with the patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time. The figure was too distant for Hastings to make out details, but something about its proportions and posture suggested it was not entirely human. When Hastings blinked and looked again, the figure was gone, but the sensation of being observed continued until he was well clear of the valley. The news of the Carter family's disappearance and the condition of their cabin spread through the mountain communities like wildfire, bringing investigators, curiosity seekers, and clergy from throughout the region. Sheriff James Morrison, no relation to the family whose ruined homestead Samuel Carter had discovered, led the official investigation, bringing with him a team of experienced lawmen and a county coroner to examine the evidence and attempt to determine what had happened to the missing family. Morrison's investigation lasted 3 days and yielded results that raised more questions than they answered. The shallow graves that Hastings had discovered were carefully excavated, revealing contents that challenged both the investigators' professional experience and their fundamental beliefs about the nature of good and evil in the world. The first grave contained human remains, but they had been arranged in ways that suggested ritualistic purpose rather than conventional burial. Bones were sorted by type and size, creating patterns within the grave that reminded the investigators of the symbols they had found carved into the cabin's walls. Some of the bones showed signs of violence, deep scratches and gouges that could have been made by animal claws, but were too regular and systematic to be the result of ordinary predation. The second grave contained items of clothing and personal belongings that were identified as having belonged to the Carter family, but these objects had been arranged with the same ritualistic care as the bones in the first grave. Samuel's blacksmith tools were present, but they had been twisted and deformed in ways that suggested the application of tremendous heat and pressure. Margaret's sewing supplies were there, but the thread had been woven into complex patterns that served no practical purpose and hurt the eyes to examine directly. The third grave, the smallest of the excavated sites, contained something that made even the most experienced investigators step back in horror. Inside a crude wooden box were items that appeared to be organic in nature, but had been preserved in ways that defied explanation. The coroner, Dr. Ezra Whitman, examined these materials with the clinical detachment his profession required, but privately admitted that he had never encountered anything similar in 20 years of medical practice. These specimens, Dr. Whitman wrote in his confidential report to Sheriff Morrison, appear to be human tissue that has been somehow transformed by processes unknown to medical science. They show signs of having been subjected to conditions that should have resulted in rapid decomposition, yet they remain perfectly preserved. More disturbing still, they show evidence of continued biological activity despite being separated from any viable organism. The investigation team also discovered evidence that the Carter family had not been the only victims of whatever force had claimed their valley. A more thorough search of the surrounding forest revealed the ruins of at least 2 other homesteads, both showing signs of the same systematic destruction that had befallen the Carter cabin. In each case, personal belongings had been arranged in ritualistic patterns, graves had been dug and filled with materials that defied conventional explanation, and the structures themselves had been modified in ways that served no practical purpose. Sheriff Morrison's final report, filed with the Arkansas State Police and forwarded to federal authorities, concluded that the Carter family had been victims of unknown parties engaged in practices of an occult nature. The report recommended that the valley be declared off-limits to settlement, and that regular patrols be established to prevent other families from suffering similar fates. But the report also included a classified addendum that was not made public until decades later. In this secret section, Morrison wrote, "It is my professional opinion that the Carter family and the other victims found in this valley were not murdered by human agents, regardless of how their deaths might eventually be classified for official purposes. The evidence suggests the involvement of forces that lie outside the normal scope of law enforcement investigation. I strongly recommend that this area be permanently closed to civilian access and that appropriate authorities be consulted regarding the need for measures beyond conventional police protection. The Carter family cabin was boarded up and marked with warnings against trespassing, but these precautions proved insufficient to keep curiosity seekers and sensation seekers from venturing into the valley. Over the following months, several individuals who ignored the warnings and visited the site reported experiences that reinforced the supernatural reputation the location had acquired. A group of local teenagers who visited the cabin on a dare reported that they heard voices calling to them from inside the boarded structure, voices that mimicked their own names and pleaded for help in tones of desperate fear. A traveling preacher who attempted to cleanse the site through prayer and biblical recitation fled after claiming that he had been physically attacked by invisible forces that left scratches on his face and arms. Even hardened criminals who thought to use the abandoned cabin as a hideout found themselves unable to remain in the valley for more than a few hours, driven away by sensations of being watched and hunted by something that remained just beyond the edge of perception. The story of the Carter family cabin began to spread beyond the local mountain communities, attracting the attention of newspaper reporters, paranormal investigators, and academics interested in folklore and unexplained phenomena. Articles appeared in publications throughout Arkansas and Missouri, describing the mystery of the vanished family and the supernatural events that continued to plague their former home. But despite the attention and investigation, no satisfactory explanation was ever found for what had happened to Samuel, Margaret, Thomas, Sarah, and little Emma Carter. The physical evidence suggested violence and death, but the specific details of their fate remained as mysterious as the forces that had claimed them. The valley that had promised them a fresh start had become their tomb, and their cabin had been transformed from a symbol of hope into a monument to the dark secrets that the Ozark Mountains guard so jealously. As summer turned to autumn in 1895, the Carter family cabin stood empty and silent, its broken windows staring blindly across the valley where no birds sang and no animals came to drink from the clear stream that continued to flow as if nothing had ever disturbed the peace of that cursed place. But those who knew the story understood that the cabin was not truly empty. It was inhabited by something far worse than human ghosts, something that was patient and hung, and always waiting for the next family to venture into its domain. The thing that had claimed the Carter family was still there, still watching, still ready to add new victims to the collection of bones and belongings it had assembled in the shallow graves around the homestead. The valley had tasted human blood and found it to its liking, and it would wait as long as necessary for the next opportunity to feed. In the decades that followed the disappearance of the Carter family, their abandoned cabin became the focal point for a collection of theories and speculations that ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. Local authorities, academic researchers, paranormal investigators, and amateur theorists all attempted to provide rational explanations for the events of 1895, but each investigation seemed to raise new questions rather than providing definitive answers. The most conventional theory, favored by law enforcement officials and practical-minded locals, suggested that the Carter family had been victims of human predators, either criminal gangs operating in the remote mountain regions or hostile individuals who viewed isolated homesteaders as easy targets for robbery and violence. This explanation had the advantage of not requiring belief in supernatural forces, and it aligned with documented cases of frontier families who had been attacked by outlaws or claim jumpers seeking to steal their land and possessions. Sheriff Morrison, despite his private reservations recorded in the classified addendum to his official report, publicly supported this theory as the most likely explanation for the family's fate. He pointed to the valuable tools and equipment that Samuel Carter would have brought to his homestead, noting that such items would have been highly prized by criminal elements operating in the area. The ritualistic arrangement of the family's belongings could be explained as the work of disturbed individuals who derived psychological satisfaction from creating elaborate displays of their victims' possessions. However, this theory failed to account for several troubling aspects of the case. No known criminal gangs had been reported operating in the specific region where the Carter cabin was located, and the remote nature of the valley made it an unlikely target for opportunistic thieves who would have had easier pickings closer to established towns and travel routes. More significantly, the condition of the cabin itself, the systematic destruction, the elaborate carved symbols, and the modification of the fireplace suggested a level of planning and purpose that went beyond ordinary criminal activity. Dr. Ezra Whitman, the coroner who had examined the physical evidence found at the site, privately favored a different explanation that he termed primitive religious mania. Whitman theorized that the Carter family had encountered individuals practicing some form of occult religion, possibly derived from Native American traditions or imported European folk beliefs. Such practitioners, according to Whitman's theory, might have viewed the family's presence in the valley as a violation of sacred ground and responded with ritualistic violence designed to appease whatever spiritual forces they believed inhabited the area. This theory gained some support from anthropologists who pointed out that the Ozark Mountains had been home to various Native American tribes for thousands of years before European settlement. The Cherokee, in particular, had considered certain locations within the mountains to be sacred sites where spiritual ceremonies were conducted and ancestral spirits were believed to dwell. The stone circle that Samuel Carter had discovered during his final hunting expedition might have been evidence of such sacred ground, and the family's presence could have been interpreted as desecration requiring violent correction. However, experts on Cherokee culture and religion disputed this interpretation, pointing out that the symbols found at the Carter cabin bore no resemblance to known Cherokee pictographs or ceremonial markings. Additionally, the Cherokee tribes had been forcibly removed from Arkansas during the 1830s as part of the Trail of Tears, making it unlikely that practicing tribal members would have been present in the area during the 1890s. The violence described in the evidence also conflicted with Cherokee spiritual practices, which emphasized harmony with nature rather than ritualistic brutality. A more exotic variation of the religious theory was proposed by Professor Marcus Aldrich of the University of Arkansas, who had studied European folk traditions and their transplantation to the American frontier. Aldrich suggested that the Carter family might have encountered practitioners of what he termed Old World devil worship, European occult traditions that had been brought to America by immigrants who maintained their ancestral beliefs despite the Christian environment of their new homeland. Aldrich pointed to documented cases of European folk magic practitioners who had settled in remote American locations where they could continue their traditional practices without interference from religious or civil authorities. Such individuals might have been drawn to the Ozark Mountains by the area's reputation for isolation and supernatural activity, establishing hidden communities where ancient rituals could be performed without detection by mainstream society. This theory helped explain the sophisticated nature of the symbols found at the Carter cabin, which suggested knowledge of complex occult traditions rather than improvised primitive practices. However, Aldrich's theory suffered from the same lack of concrete evidence that plagued other explanations. No known occult communities had been identified in the area, and no practitis, owners of European folk magic, had been documented in the region during the relevant time period. As news of the Carter family mystery spread beyond the immediate region, it attracted the attention of a new class of investigators who approached the case from a decidedly different perspective. These were the early pioneers of what would later be called paranormal research. Individuals who believed that conventional science and rational investigation were insufficient to explain all the phenomena that occurred in the natural world. Among the most prominent of these investigators was Dr. Helena Blavatsky's protege, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, who had gained fame as a co-founder of the Theosophical Society and an investigator of spiritualist phenomena. Olcott visited the Carter cabin site in the autumn of 1896, bringing with him a team of associates trained in what they called psychic investigation techniques. Olcott's report, published in the Theosophical Society's journal, described the Carter Cabin Valley as a location where the veil between the material and spiritual worlds has been torn by forces of tremendous malevolence. According to Olcott, the area exhibited what he termed psychic scarring, permanent damage to the spiritual atmosphere that made it a conduit for entities from other planes of existence. The tragedy that befell the Carter family, Olcott wrote, was not the result of human agency, but rather the consequence of their unfortunate selection of a location that serves as a gateway for beings whose nature and intentions are fundamentally hostile to human life. These entities, which exist primarily in spiritual rather than physical form, are capable of manipulating matter and energy in ways that appear supernatural to observers limited to three-dimensional perception. Olcott's investigation claimed to have documented ongoing supernatural activity at the cabin site, including temperature fluctuations that couldn't be explained by weather patterns. RNS, electromagnetic disturbances that affected compass readings and watch mechanisms, and direct communication with entities that identified themselves as the spiritual remnants of previous victims. According to Olcott's report, these entities warned his investigation team that the force responsible for their deaths was still active and would continue to claim victims as long as humans ventured into its domain. While Olcott's supernatural explanation was dismissed by mainstream investigators as pseudoscientific nonsense, it gained significant support among individuals who had personally experienced unexplained phenomena at the Carter cabin site. Local residents who had visited the location reported experiences that seemed to validate Olcott's claims, encounters with apparitions, unexplained sounds and movements, and overwhelming sensations of dread that drove them away from the area. Perhaps the most disturbing theory to emerge from the various investigations was proposed by Dr. Silas Marsh, a alienist, as psychiatrists were then called, from the State Hospital for the Insane in Little Rock. Marsh had studied the case files and interviewed several individuals who had visited the Carter cabin site, and he developed what he called the contagious madness hypothesis. According to Marsh's theory, the Carter family had been victims of a form of collective psychological breakdown brought on by the extreme isolation and stress of frontier life. The harsh winter, the limited food supplies, and the constant threat of danger had created conditions where normal mental processes became distorted, leading to paranoid delusions and eventually to violence directed either at perceived external threats or among the family members themselves. Marsh suggested that the elaborate arrangements of belongings and the carved symbols found at the cabin were evidence of obsessive-compulsive behaviors that had developed as the family's mental state deteriorated. The ritualistic elements could be explained as attempts to impose order and meaning on experiences that had become chaotic and incomprehensible due to psychological breakdown. Most disturbing about Marsh's theory was his suggestion that the psychological conditions that had affected the Carter family were somehow still present at the cabin site, creating a form of environmental madness that could affect anyone who spent extended time in the location. This would explain why subsequent visitors to the cabin reported supernatural experiences. They were actually experiencing the same psychological distortions that had claimed the original victims. The human mind, Marsh wrote in his analysis, is far more fragile than we commonly acknowledge, and under conditions of extreme stress, it is capable of creating experiences that seem completely real to the sufferer but have no objective existence. The tragedy of the Carter family may be that they became trapped in a shared delusion so powerful that it ultimately led to their destruction. Marsh's theory gained some support from medical professionals who had studied the effects of isolation and deprivation on mental health, but it failed to account for the physical evidence found at the cabin site. The systematic destruction of the structure, the carved symbols, and the carefully arranged graves suggested planning and execution that would have been beyond the capabilities of individuals suffering from severe psychological breakdown. As the 19th century drew to a close, the mystery of the Carter family cabin remained unsolved despite the various theories that had been proposed to explain it. Each explanation accounted for some aspects of the case while failing to address others, and none provided the comprehensive understanding that would have allowed authorities to close the investigation with confidence. Local resi, dense, practical people who were more concerned with their daily survival than with abstract theories, developed their own informal consensus about the Carter cabin. They understood, with the kind of folk wisdom that comes from generations of living close to the land, that some places in the world are simply not meant for human habitation. The valley where the Carter family had tried to build their new life was one of those places, a location where the normal rules of existence didn't apply, and where the consequences of ignoring ancient warnings could be swift and terrible. The cabin itself continued to deteriorate as the years passed, its boarded windows and warning signs providing inadequate protection against the elements and the occasional trespasser brave enough to ignore local warnings. But those who knew the area's history understood that the physical structure was less important than what it represented, a monument to human ambition destroyed by forces that lay beyond the reach of conventional understanding. Whether those forces were human, natural, or supernatural remained a matter of debate, but their power was undeniable. The Carter family cabin had become a tomb not just for the 5 individuals who had disappeared there, but for the dreams and hopes they had carried into the wilderness. It stood as a stark reminder that the American frontier, for all its promise of freedom and opportunity, could also be a place where nightmares took physical form and claimed the lives of those who ventured too far from the safety of civilization. The thing that had waited in the valley was patient, and it was still waiting. The theories and investigations might continue for decades or centuries, but the fundamental reality remained unchanged. The Carter family cabin was a place where evil had taken root, and no amount of rational explanation could cleanse it of the dark nest that had made it home. More than a century has passed since the Carter family vanished into the mists of Ozark legend, yet their cabin continues to cast a shadow that extends far beyond the boundaries of its remote valley. What began as a local tragedy has evolved into something much larger, a touchstone for discussions about the supernatural, a pilgrimage site for those seeking encounters with the unknown, and a persistent reminder that some mysteries resist all attempts at rational resolution. The physical structure that once housed the Carter family's hopes and witnessed their terror has largely succumbed to the inexorable march of time and weather. The roof collapsed sometime in the 1920s, the walls began to sag and separate in the 1930s, and by the 1950s, only the stone foundation and the modified fireplace remained to mark the location where so much hope had been transformed into horror. Yet even these remnants continue to exert a peculiar fascination over those who learn their story. Modern paranormal investigators, equipped with technologies that Colonel Olcott could never have imagined, have made pilgrimages to the Carter Cabin site for decades. Their electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and digital recording equipment have documented phenomena that they claim validate the supernatural explanations proposed by earlier researchers. Temperature anomalies, unexplained electromagnetic signatures, and recordings of voices speaking in languages that linguistic experts cannot identify have been collected from the site and distributed through websites, books, and television programs devoted to unexplained phenomena. Dr. Jennifer Blackwood, a professor of folklore at the University of Arkansas, who has studied the Carter Cabin legend for more than 20 years, offers a different perspective on the case's enduring appeal. The story of the Carter family represents something full, fundamental about the American experience, she explains. It embodies our deepest fears about isolation, about the price of independence, and about the possibility that our rational, scientific worldview might be inadequate to explain the full range of human experience. Blackwood's research has traced the evolution of the Carter Cabin story through more than a century of retellings, documenting how details have been added, subtracted, and modified to serve the needs of successive generations of storytellers. What's fascinating, she notes, is how consistent the core elements have remained despite all the variations. The isolated family, the gradual escalation of supernatural activity, the mysterious disappearance, and the sense that something malevolent continues to inhabit the site. These elements appear in virtually every version of the story, regardless of when or by whom it's being told. The cabin's legend has been incorporated into the broader folklore of the Ozark Mountains, taking its place alongside stories of the Fook monster, the gentry, mysterious beings said to live in parallel to human society, and various other supernatural entities that are said to inhabit the region's forests and valleys. Local tour guides include the Carter Cabin in their presentations about Ozark mysteries, though they're careful to warn visitors that the actual site remains extremely difficult to reach and potentially dangerous due to both natural hazards and, according to some, supernatural ones. The advent of the Internet has given the Carter Cabin story a global audience, with websites dedicated to paranormal phenomena featuring detailed accounts of the family's disappearance and the various theories that have been proposed to explain it. Online forums buzz with discussions between believers and skeptics, each side marshalling evidence to support their interpretation of events that occurred more than a century ago. Ghost hunters and amateur investigators regularly organize expeditions to the site, though many of these modern explorers report that finding the exact location of the original cabin has become increasingly difficult as the forest has reclaimed the valley and obscured the landmarks that earlier visitors used for navigation. Perhaps most significantly, the Carter Cabin story has influenced a generation of writers, filmmakers, and artists who have drawn inspiration from its themes of isolation, supernatural menace, and the vulnerability of human reason when confronted with forces beyond its comprehension. Horror novels featuring isolated cabins threatened by ancient evils, documentary films exploring unexplained disappearances in remote locations, and television series devoted to paranormal investigation all owe some debt to the template established by the Carter family mystery. The psychological appeal of the story lies partly in its ambiguity. Unlike fictional horror stories, which typically provide resolution through the defeat of evil forces or the explanation of mysterious phenomena, the Carter Cabin case offers no such closure. The family's fate remains unknown, the nature of the force that claimed them remains undefined, and the threat they encountered continues to lurk in the shadows of possibility. This uncertainty allows each person who encounters the story to project their own fears and beliefs onto the narrative, creating a personalized horror that resonates with individual anxieties about death, isolation, and the limits of human understanding. Modern researchers who have attempted to investigate the historical accuracy of the Carter cabin story have found themselves confronting the same frustrating lack of definitive evidence that has characterized the case since 1895. County records from the relevant time period are incomplete, and many documents that might have provided crucial information were lost in courthouse fires, floods, and other disasters that plagued rural Arkansas during the early 20th century. The absence of photographic evidence from the original investigation means that modern investigators must rely on written descriptions that were often influenced by the personal biases and limited scientific understanding of their authors. Dr. Robert Chen, a historian at Arkansas State University who has researched frontier disappearances throughout the region, points out that the Carter family case, while certainly unusual in its details, was part of a broader pattern of mysterious vanishings that occurred during the settlement period. The frontier was a dangerous place, Chen explains, and families could disappear for any number of reasons: disease, accidents, animal attacks, criminal violence, or simply the decision to abandon a failed homestead and try their luck elsewhere. What makes the Carter case distinctive is the elaborate nature of the evidence left behind and the persistent reports of supernatural activity at the site. Chen's research has identified at least a dozen other cases of frontier families who disappeared under mysterious circumstances in Arkansas, Missouri, and surrounding states during the late 19th century. In several of these cases, the missing family's belongings were found arranged in ritualistic patterns, and local residents reported supernatural phenomena at the sites for years afterward. This suggests that the Carter family case, rather than being a unique occurrence, might represent part of a larger pattern of frontier disappearances that involved similar causes and circumstances. The question, Chen notes, is whether these similarities indicate a common supernatural threat, as paranormal researchers suggest, or whether they reflect common psychological and social factors that affected isolated frontier families in predictable ways. The answer depends partly on one's worldview and partly on what kind of evidence one is willing to accept as valid. The debate over the Carter cabin continues to reflect broader cultural tensions between scientific rationalism and traditional beliefs about the supernatural. Skeptics argue that the story represents a classic example of how folklore develops around unexplained events, with supernatural elements being added over time to explain circumstances that were originally the result of natural but poorly understood causes. Believers counter that the consistency of supernatural reports from the site, spanning more than a century and involving numerous independent witnesses, suggests the presence of genuine paranormal phenomena that science has not yet developed the tools to study effectively. What both sides can agree on is the power of the Carter cabin story to evoke profound emotional responses in those who encounter it. The tale speaks to fundamental human fears about isolation, vulnerability, and the possibility that the world contains forces that are indifferent or hostile to human welfare. It reminds us that despite all our technological advances and scientific understanding, there remain corners of the world where ancient mysteries persist and where the comfortable certainties of modern life prove inadequate to explain the full range of human experience. The valley where the Carter family built their cabin remains largely uninhabited today, though it's no longer as isolated as it was in 1895. Logging roads and hiking trails have made the area more accessible to modern visitors, and the Ozark National Forest designation has provided some measure of protection for the site's historical significance. Yet even contemporary visitors report experiencing the same sense of unease that has characterized accounts of the location for more than a century. Local idents, particularly those whose families have lived in the area for generations, maintain a respectful distance from the Carter cabin site. They understand, with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from intimate knowledge of the land, that some places are best left undisturbed. The forest has reclaimed the valley, and they're content to let it remain that way. But the story lives on, passed from generation to generation, told around campfires and shared on internet forums, investigated by researchers and sensationalized by television producers. The Carter family cabin has achieved a kind of immortality through the persistence of human curiosity about the unknown and unknowable. It stands as a monument not just to the 5 individuals who disappeared there, but to the enduring power of mystery itself. Whether Samuel, Margaret, Thomas, Sarah, and little Emma Carter met their fate at the hands of human predators, natural disasters, supernatural entities, or their own psychological breakdown, may never be definitively determined. But their story continues to serve as a reminder that the world is vast and complex, that human understanding has limits, and that some questions may be more important than their answers. In the end, the true legacy of the Carter family cabin lies not in any specific explanation for what happened there, but in its ability to make us confront the uncomfortable possibility that we may not live in the rational, predictable universe that our modern worldview assumes. It forces us to acknowledge that there may be spaces in the world where different rules apply, where ancient powers still hold sway, and where human reason and technological sophistication offer no protection against forces that have been waiting in the darkness since before our ancestors first dreamed of civilization. The cabin is gone now, reclaimed by the forest that surrounds it, but the mystery endures. Somewhere in the Ozark Mountains, in a valley that looks peaceful and inviting to casual observers, something waits with the patience of geological time for the next family brave enough or foolish enough to believe that any place on Earth is truly safe for human habitation. The Carter family thought they had found a sanctuary where they could build a new life, but they discovered instead that they had entered a realm where nightmares take physical form and human dreams become food for ancient hungers. Their story serves as both warning and invitation, a warning to those who would venture into the wild places of the world without proper respect for forces they don't understand, and an invitation to those who refuse to accept that all mysteries can be solved through the application of logic and scientific method. The Carter family cabin reminds us that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we like to admit, and that sometimes the price of that knowledge is higher than we're prepared to pay. The thing that claimed the Carter family is still out there, still waiting, still patient in its hunger for human suffering and terror. It has fed before, and it will feed again, for it understands something that we in our comfortable modern lives prefer to forget: that human civilization is a thin veneer laid over an abyss of chaos and darkness, and that veneer can be torn away more easily than we dare to imagine. The Carter family cabin became a tomb not just for 5 individuals, but for the illusion that anywhere in this world is truly safe from the forces that have been hunting humanity since we first crawled out of caves and dared to believe that we could make the darkness our own. Their story continues because it speaks to a truth that we ignore at our own peril, that we are not alone in this world, and not everything that shares it with us wishes us well.